April 28, 1942, Port Moresby, New Guinea. First Lieutenant Karl Polifka steadied his hand on the throttle of his F-4 Lightning as Japanese Zero fighters materialized through the clouds 2,000 feet above him. The veteran pilot from Oregon glanced down at the empty nose section of his aircraft, where 4 K-17 cameras now occupied the space that should have held 450 caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon. No weapons, no protection, just photographic equipment and the thin hope that speed alone would save his life. The mathematics of survival were brutal and simple. He was flying a 14-ton aircraft stripped of every defensive capability into the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific theater. What the Japanese pilots diving toward him didn't know, what German fighter aces over Europe would discover months later, was that these unarmed American reconnaissance pilots were about to revolutionize aerial warfare through tactics so audacious they bordered on psychological warfare. Within 18 months, pilots flying without guns would photograph every major enemy installation from Rabaul to Berlin, survive encounters that should have been fatal, and prove that sometimes the deadliest weapon in aerial combat wasn't firepower at all, but rather the absolute mastery of speed, positioning, and the enemy's own assumptions about what they were facing. The story of how American pilots deliberately flew into combat without weapons begins not with tactical brilliance, but with desperate necessity in the months following Pearl Harbor. The United States Army Air Forces faced an intelligence crisis of staggering proportions. Enemy positions across the Pacific remained unmapped. Japanese troop concentrations moved undetected. Bomber crews flew missions against targets whose exact locations existed only as rough estimates on outdated maps. The requirement for photographic reconnaissance was immediately apparent, but the specialized aircraft needed for such missions simply didn't exist. Major General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, understood the problem with brutal clarity. "I can't bomb what I can't see," he told his staff in early 1942, "and I can't see what I haven't photographed." The solution emerged from Lockheed's facility in Burbank, California, where engineers confronted a radical proposal. Take the P-38 Lightning, already the Army's most advanced fighter, and strip it of every weapon to create a pure reconnaissance platform. The logic was counterintuitive to the point of seeming suicidal. Remove the guns that made a fighter deadly, eliminate the ammunition that provided sustained combat capability, and send pilots alone into enemy territory with nothing but cameras and their skill. But the engineering calculations told a different story. A standard P-38E Lightning fighter carried 450 caliber Browning machine guns with 500 rounds each, plus one 20-millimeter Hispano cannon with 150 rounds. The total weight of armament, ammunition, and associated equipment exceeded 1,800 pounds. That weight represented drag, complexity, and, most significantly, wasted performance in an aircraft whose mission wasn't to fight, but to see. Colonel Minton Kay, Director of Photographic Intelligence, championed the modification with the intensity of someone who understood that tactical intelligence would determine who controlled the Pacific skies. "Speed is the reconnaissance pilot's only weapon," he argued to skeptical commanders at Wright Field. "Every pound of armament we remove translates directly into speed and altitude capability that keeps our pilots alive." The first production run of 100 P-38Es was diverted to a modification center in Dallas, Texas, where Leo Childs supervised their transformation into F-4 reconnaissance aircraft. The nose section, previously packed with weapons, was completely redesigned to accommodate 4 K-17 cameras, 3 with 6-inch focal lengths for mapping work, and 1 with a 24-inch lens for detailed reconnaissance. Additional fuel tanks extended range from 575 miles to over 1,000 miles. The cockpit received specialized controls for camera operation, allowing the pilot to function simultaneously as navigator, photographer, and defensive tactician. The weight savings exceeded every projection. Without armament, the F-4 weighed nearly a ton less than its fighter counterpart. The performance improvement was immediate and dramatic. Maximum speed increased from 390 miles per hour to 417 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Climb rate improved by 300 feet per minute. Service ceiling pushed past 40,000 feet, altitudes where most enemy interceptors gasped for oxygen and maneuverability. But statistics on paper meant nothing until someone actually flew these unarmed aircraft into combat and survived. That burden fell to First Lieutenant Karl Polifka, known as Pop, to his squadron mates despite being only 32 years old. Polifka had joined the Army Air Corps in 1937 after leaving the construction business in Oregon. His Russian-Czech heritage had given him, in his own words, a solid dislike of totalitarian governments and a personal motivation to see the Axis defeated. On April 4, 1942, Polifka led Flight A of the 8th Photographic Squadron into Australia with 4 operational F-4 Lightnings. These were the first P-38s of any variant to reach the Pacific Combat Theater. Within 3 weeks, Polifka would fly the type's first operational missions, launching from primitive airstrips in Australia to photograph Japanese positions across New Guinea and New Britain. The first mission profiles were exercises in controlled terror, flying alone at altitudes between 20,000 and 30,000 feet. Reconnaissance pilots penetrated hundreds of miles into Japanese-controlled territory without fighter escort, without defensive armament, and without any support beyond their own skill and their aircraft's performance. Weather in the Southwest Pacific made navigation a constant challenge. Tropical storms materialized without warning. Cloud layers obscured landmarks. The vast distances between friendly bases meant that navigation errors could be fatal, even without enemy contact. Polifka's approach to reconnaissance flying established doctrines that would guide American photo pilots throughout the war. Speed was paramount. Altitude provided survival margin. Cloud cover offered concealment when needed. But most critically, reconnaissance pilots had to complete their photographic runs regardless of enemy opposition. Turning back with incomplete coverage meant another pilot would have to fly the mission again, accumulating risk without intelligence gain. The Japanese discovered these strange, unarmed lightnings during Polifka's early missions over Rabaul in May 1942. Japanese fighter pilots, accustomed to engaging Allied bombers and fighters in conventional combat, found themselves confused by aircraft that refused to engage, that simply accelerated away at speeds Japanese fighters couldn't match, that climbed to altitudes where pursuit became impossible. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most successful fighter aces, encountered F-4s repeatedly during 1942 and 1943. His post-war assessment captured the psychological impact these encounters produced. The reconnaissance lightnings destroyed morale among our pilots. We could intercept them, sometimes even position for attack, but we could not catch them. The twin-engine American fighters would simply accelerate and climb away. It was like chasing ghosts that could be seen, but never touched. The tactical doctrine that emerged from these early missions centered on what reconnaissance pilots called the golden rules of photo flying. First, complete the photographic run before taking any evasive action. Intelligence value came from completed coverage, not from surviving pilots who returned with empty cameras. Second, use speed and altitude as primary defensive weapons. The F-4 and later F-5 variants could outrun and outclimb most enemy fighters if flown at optimal performance settings. Third, never engage in turning combat. The Lightning's twin-engine configuration provided redundancy and power, but at lower speeds and in tight turns, single-engine fighters maintained advantages that could prove fatal. But the most psychologically fascinating tactic developed by reconnaissance pilots involved exploiting enemy assumptions about American aircraft capabilities. German and Japanese pilots knew the P-38 Lightning as a heavily armed fighter with devastating nose-mounted firepower. The concentration of 4 machine guns and a cannon in the nose eliminated convergence problems that plagued wing-mounted weapons. Lightning fighters could deliver accurate fire at ranges exceeding 400 yards, making them respected and feared opponents in air combat. Reconnaissance pilots flying unarmed F-5s discovered they could leverage this reputation through tactical bluffing. When intercepted by enemy fighters, pilots with prior fighter experience would turn directly into the attack, mimicking the aggressive head-on tactics employed by armed Lightning pilots. The psychological effect on enemy pilots was immediate and dramatic. German fighter pilots, conditioned to respect the Lightning's nose-mounted firepower, would frequently break off attacks rather than risk head-on engagement with what they assumed was a fully armed fighter. The tactic worked because it exploited perfect information asymmetry. The reconnaissance pilot knew he carried no weapons. The enemy pilot assumed standard Lightning armament. In the seconds required to make combat decisions at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, assumption trumped verification. By the time an enemy pilot might realize the Lightning wasn't firing, the two aircraft had passed each other, and the geometry favored the faster American aircraft. Technical Sergeant Don Hayes, who served with the 34th Photo-Reconnaissance Squadron in Europe, later described the tactic with clinical precision. Pilots coming into our unit who had prior experience as fighter pilots would often turn into the enemy, forcing a confrontation. Most aggressor pilots knew about P-38 nose armament and would break off their attack rather than risk being taken down. Since the F-5 was unarmed, we could only get away with this tactic once or twice against the same pilot. But in the vastness of European and Pacific skies, we rarely encountered the same enemy twice. A second defensive technique exploited the F-5's unique flight characteristics. The Lightning's twin Allison engines featured counter-rotating propellers, eliminating the torque effects that plagued single-engine fighters. This design characteristic provided perfect balance in all flight regimes. Reconnaissance pilots discovered they could use this advantage during low-altitude pursuits by executing severe right-hand turns at treetop level. Enemy fighters attempting to follow would find their single engine's torque, forcing them into uncontrollable snap rolls at low altitude where recovery was impossible. The pursuing aircraft would literally snap roll into the ground, eliminating the threat without a single shot being fired. The tactic was brutally effective, but required precise judgment and nerves of steel. The reconnaissance pilot had to allow the enemy fighter close enough to commit to the pursuit, then execute the maneuver at an altitude low enough that the enemy couldn't recover, while maintaining sufficient height for his own aircraft to maneuver safely. Getting the timing wrong meant either the tactic failed or the reconnaissance pilot himself crashed. By mid-1942, Polifka's missions over New Guinea and New Britain had provided General Douglas MacArthur with photographic intelligence that transformed Allied offensive planning. Japanese airfield construction, troop concentrations, and supply installations appeared in detailed imagery that allowed American planners to target enemy vulnerabilities with precision impossible just months earlier. The intelligence value was so significant that Polifka received direct commendations from MacArthur's headquarters, rare recognition for reconnaissance work that typically remained classified. In November 1942, Polifka rotated back to the United States. then deployed to North Africa, where he established reconnaissance operations for the Mediterranean theater. His leadership style emphasized aggressive flying tempered by tactical discipline. He demanded complete photographic coverage regardless of opposition, but insisted his pilots use every available advantage to survive encounters with enemy fighters. The combination produced reconnaissance units that consistently delivered intelligence while maintaining survivability rates that defied conventional wisdom about unarmed aircraft operating in defended airspace. The evolution from F-4 to F-5 variants brought continuous improvements in camera systems, range, and performance. The F-5A, based on the P-38G fighter, carried improved K-17 cameras and featured better high-altitude performance. The F-5B, modified from P-38J airframes, incorporated major aerodynamic improvements, including dive flaps that enhanced control at high speeds. Most significantly, the F-5E variant introduced a trimetragon camera system consisting of 3 vertical K-17 cameras and 2 K-22 oblique cameras. This configuration allowed coverage of approximately 3 miles width from 10,000 feet altitude, dramatically improving mapping efficiency. Production numbers told the story of reconnaissance's growing importance. Lockheed modified over 1,200 P-38 airframes into photographic reconnaissance variants, representing roughly 1 of every 9 Lightnings built. The Dallas Modification Center operated continuously from 1942 through 1945, converting fighter aircraft into reconnaissance platforms with specialized equipment that made them among the war's most valuable intelligence-gathering assets. The reconnaissance units that operated these aircraft developed cultures distinct from fighter and bomber squadrons. Photo pilots flew alone, navigated independently, and made tactical decisions without formation support or command guidance. The solitary nature of reconnaissance missions attracted pilots with specific psychological profiles: self-reliant individuals comfortable with extended solo flight, technically proficient navigators capable of finding targets across vast distances, and tacticians who could evaluate threat situations and execute defensive maneuvers without external input. Colonel Charles Hoy, who transferred to the 34th Photo Reconnaissance Squadron from fighters, described the transition. "We never knew why we were drafted out of fighters into photo, actually with a promise that we would get back into fighters soon. But we never looked back. Seeing our mission as Photo Joes got in your blood quickly when you understood the mission and could visualize the results. I had honestly never even heard of photo reconnaissance, much less expected to enter the war as a singleton. To suddenly be the navigator, the photo operator, and alone was mind-boggling." The D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, represented reconnaissance aviation's finest hour and demonstrated the strategic importance of unarmed photo pilots. In the months preceding the invasion, reconnaissance squadrons flew thousands of missions photographing every mile of the Normandy coastline. The 34th Photo Reconnaissance Squadron alone flew over 500 sorties between March and June 1944, mapping beach obstacles, defensive positions, and inland routes with detail that allowed Allied planners to identify every significant German defensive position. 2 days before the invasion, pilot Joe Thompson flew a critical mission photographing German batteries at Grand Camp, overlooking what would become Omaha Beach. Flying at 2,500 feet to obtain vertical photographs with sufficient resolution to identify individual gun positions, Thompson completed his run under intense anti-aircraft fire, landed with his aircraft damaged by flak fragments, and delivered film that intelligence officers were examining with still-turning propeller blades visible through the operations tent windows. The photographs Thompson risked his life to obtain were being analyzed by a brigadier general and a British Air Vice Marshal within an hour of landing, demonstrating the priority placed on reconnaissance intelligence at the highest command levels. The intelligence processing infrastructure supporting reconnaissance operations grew into a massive enterprise. At the Allied Central Interpretation Unit supporting D-Day planning, 1,700 officers and enlisted personnel studied 85,000 images daily. Photo interpreters worked 12-hour shifts, examining stereoscopic pairs of photographs through specialized magnifying equipment, identifying enemy positions, counting vehicles, measuring fortifications, and producing intelligence summaries that guided every aspect of tactical and strategic planning. In the Pacific Theater, reconnaissance operations achieved results that shaped entire campaigns. During the Battle of Okinawa, the 8th Photo Squadron, still commanded by Polifka, who had returned from Europe, flew low-level oblique photography missions at last light, photographing Japanese positions with details sufficient that annotated prints were delivered to American platoons by morning. This tactical reconnaissance provided ground commanders with intelligence so current that assault plans could be adjusted based on enemy positions photographed less than 12 hours earlier. The human cost of reconnaissance operations remained consistently lower than fighter or bomber losses, but the nature of the missions produced casualties that affected squadron morale differently than combat losses in armed aircraft. When reconnaissance pilots failed to return, they disappeared over vast ocean expanses or enemy territory with no witnesses, no combat reports, and frequently no certainty about what caused their loss. The ambiguity was psychologically difficult for squadron mates who understood that mechanical failure, navigation error, weather, or enemy action could all produce identical results: a pilot who simply never came back. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the French aviator and author of the beloved children's book The Little Prince, flew F-5B reconnaissance missions with the Free French Air Force from Corsica during 1944. On July 31, 1944, Saint-Exupéry departed on a reconnaissance mission to Grenoble and Annecy at the base of the French Alps. He never returned. For 60 years, his fate remained unknown until fishermen recovered debris from his F-5B in waters off the southern French coast in 2004. The mystery surrounding his disappearance epitomized the uncertain fate of reconnaissance pilots who flew alone into hostile skies. By late 1944, reconnaissance pilots faced an evolving threat that challenged even their speed advantage: German Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighters. The Me 262, capable of speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour, could intercept even high-flying F-5s that had previously operated with relative immunity at 30,000 feet and above. Losses among reconnaissance units increased as jets began regular combat operations over Germany. The solution required fundamental tactical changes, including fighter escorts for high-priority reconnaissance missions, something that had been unnecessary throughout most of the war. The statistical achievement of reconnaissance aviation defied easy quantification because success wasn't measured in enemy aircraft destroyed or targets eliminated, but rather in intelligence provided and operations enabled. The 7th Photographic Group, operating from England, flew over 23,000 sorties between 1943 and 1945, producing more than 6 million photographic images that documented every significant industrial, military, and transportation target in occupied Europe. These photographs guided strategic bombing campaigns, identified V-weapon launch sites, assessed bomb damage, and provided intelligence that shaped Allied operational planning at every level, from tactical to strategic. The 8th Photo Reconnaissance Squadron, Polifka's original unit in the Pacific, flew over 3,400 combat missions between April 1942 and August 1945, mapping enemy positions from Australia to Japan. The squadron's photographs provided the only reliable intelligence on Japanese positions across vast areas of the Southwest Pacific, enabling MacArthur's island-hopping campaign through geographic knowledge that couldn't have been obtained any other way. In Europe, reconnaissance photography obtained 90% of aerial intelligence gathered during the war. This statistic, often overlooked in histories focused on bomber offensives and fighter combat, represented the foundation upon which all other air operations depended. Bomber crews flew missions against targets identified and assessed through reconnaissance photography. Fighter sweeps targeted enemy airfields located and mapped by photopilots. Ground offensives advanced with intelligence about enemy positions obtained through aerial reconnaissance. The legend of reconnaissance pilots who down enemy aircraft while flying unarmed proved more mythology than reality, but the psychological victories achieved through bluff tactics and defensive maneuvering were no less significant. When German or Japanese pilots broke off attacks against aircraft they assumed were armed. When pursuing fighters, snap rolled into the ground, attempting to follow impossible maneuvers, the reconnaissance pilot survived to complete his mission and deliver intelligence that would guide operations affecting thousands of Allied soldiers and airmen. Pop Polifka continued flying dangerous missions long after age and rank should have grounded him. During the Korean War, commanding the 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Wing and flying RF-51 Mustangs, he would list himself as Lieutenant Jones in mission records to avoid being grounded by headquarters staff who considered him, at 41, too old for combat flying. On July 1, 1951, Polifka flew a visual reconnaissance mission over Kaesong, North Korea, deliberately descending to low altitude to verify intelligence reports of enemy troop concentrations. His aircraft was struck by intense anti-aircraft fire. Maintaining flight for 30 miles toward friendly lines, Polifka attempted to bail out when control became impossible. His parachute caught on the aircraft's tail, and he was lost. The Silver Star awarded posthumously noted his devotion to duty in the face of extreme danger and his relentless determination to complete reconnaissance missions regardless of personal risk. These same characteristics had defined his flying since those first solitary missions over New Guinea in 1942, when he flew unarmed into unknown territory to photograph an enemy about whom Allied intelligence knew almost nothing. The F-5 Lightning reconnaissance aircraft were retired shortly after the war ended, deemed too expensive and too difficult to maintain for peacetime operations. The specialized camera equipment was removed and reallocated. The airframes themselves were either scrapped or placed in storage, but the tactical doctrines developed by reconnaissance pilots, the techniques for surviving in hostile airspace without weapons, and the proof that speed and altitude could substitute for firepower, these lessons shaped reconnaissance operations through the jet age and into the modern era. At the National Air and Space Museum, a restored F-5 sits in storage, its camera ports still visible in the modified nose section. The placard notes that reconnaissance Lightnings flew unarmed and unafraid deep within enemy territory. The phrase captures both the courage required and the tactical reality that defined photo reconnaissance. These pilots didn't fly without fear, but rather with the understanding that their mission transcended personal survival. The intelligence they gathered would save Allied lives, guide operations, and ultimately contribute to victory in ways that no amount of additional firepower could achieve. The paradox of reconnaissance aviation remains: pilots flying the most dangerous missions carried no weapons, operated alone, and survived through tactics that required split-second judgment and absolute mastery of their aircraft's performance envelope. They proved that in aerial warfare, sometimes the deadliest capability wasn't the ability to destroy the enemy, but rather the capacity to see him clearly, photograph his positions accurately, and return with intelligence that would guide others to victory. Every bomber pilot who flew against precisely identified targets, every fighter ace who swept enemy airfields located through reconnaissance photography, every ground commander who advanced with current intelligence about enemy positions owed their success to pilots who flew without guns into the most defended airspace of the war. These unarmed aviators broke no victory records in terms of aircraft destroyed, but their contribution to Allied victory was measured in missions enabled, lives saved, and operations conducted with intelligence that transformed warfare from educated guessing into precision targeting. In that transformation lay their true legacy, the proof that seeing the enemy clearly was often more valuable than fighting him blindly, and that the courage to fly alone and unarmed into hostile skies represented a form of aerial combat as demanding as any dogfight, requiring skills and determination that earned them recognition as among the war's most essential and audacious pilots.